Yes. During a pandemic, and in a crucial moment of reconciliation and reckoning with the history of racism and with the invention of something called race. It's an honor to be here, particularly for me as my mother's son, Janet Williams, who many of you know and remember. I see a few faces. Thank you so much. I remember when she was, I need a word here, when she was sworn in as a consulship. Sworn in is not the word. It's almost like being a judge, isn't it? It's quasi-judicial. But I remember the wonderful ceremony and how much this place meant to her. She graduated from St. Catherine's as well, where I now teach in 1959. And my father went to St. Thomas and graduated in 1959, maybe 1958. I gotta check on that. And he knows I'm here, so I have to be on my best behavior. When Joan Whitman approached me about this topic, I had to say yes. It's part of the reason that I came to St. Kate's, which is that I feel this institution asks us to a higher calling. It asks us to do more than simply teach and simply research. That's what I did for my PhD, and I can do that. I can do research, I can write and publish, and I do that. But it asks us to serve. It asks us to go where we are asked to go, and to give our best to wherever we are. And so that's why I'm here today. I want to say a couple of things about the term and about the topic. And I have deliberately titled this conversation and teach-in, but also I want this to be a conversation beyond this terminology, critical race theory, because the term and the reference, the thing to which it refers, is in fact being misunderstood, and is being misinformation is circulating about this particular so-called theory, critical race theory. And so I do want to talk about critical race theory and what it is, and I tried to give you all some short readings to touch on some of the issues surrounding the term. But I do think that, like many fads, crazes, things of the moment, the terminology obscures the issue and obscures the substance of what actually needs to be discussed. And so I've expanded the conversation today to include a larger conversation about what I think is behind the controversy around critical race theory, which is racism, and whether or not this country is willing to confront racism and is willing to talk honestly about racism in a way that listens, in a way that is honest and sincere. I wish I read more, and I wish I would have more. I could quote so many people, but my favorite person to quote is James Baldwin, the writer, now gone from us for nearly 40 years, who said, "Nothing that can't be faced can be changed. Everything that wants to be changed must be faced." And another quote of his that I will not get right, but it was something along the lines of, "American history is longer, more horrible, and more beautiful than anything anyone has ever written about it." And he is right about that. And I like to believe that my parents are a testament to the complexity of that history. My father went to St. Thomas as an African-American man in the 1950s, and he won the Mr. Tommy Award in 1958 as a Black man who grew up in Roundel. You should see my students' jaws drop when I tell them that, because they love to make fun of St. Thomas, just a little bit, because they're Katie's, they're St. Kate students, and they love their school, they love their institution, and they love the sisters and what the sisters represent, and what the mission represents, and what the core vow of this order is, to love the dear neighbor without distinction. I use that today in 2021 in this institution across the parking lot, to love the dear neighbor without distinction. And I want you to know that the students at St. Kate's learn that it is part of why they are there, and it is part of what we learn. It's how we approach the education, it's how we approach the learning. So I want to be as brief as I can, because I really do want this to be a conversation. I know there are many questions, and I know there is too much to talk about, and I know we have until 5 o'clock. So I'm going to try to do what I think I can do, which is to give us two stories, or two aspects of this. One is what I think is the reality of our moment and the reality of our society. And the other is trying to understand why this controversy and this conversation is happening, and to what end. Why is it that this theory in a society which otherwise has very little interest in theory, I might note. I mean, if I tell people that I study sociological theory, I mean, they fall asleep by the time I get to the word theory. You know, no one's ever asked me about theory, anything. No one wants to talk about that. And all of a sudden, it's gotten some interest. And so let's try to get into this a bit. And let me start with this. And I had just about 6 slides, and I hope they don't have too many words on them, because I have a bad reputation for that, my students tell me. I was trying to put them in order, and I thought, well, where do I start? Do I begin with what everybody is saying, or do I begin with what I know to be true from what I learned from my teachers and in my education, what I learned from students and what I teach? And so I begin with what's true, and I think that this is crucial to understanding everything else. I title this Race and Racism, Facts and Truths, and there's many. I'll also say that I'm happy to share this slide presentation with all of you. So if you want to look at it later, you can have your own copies, and Joan can distribute them. So just know that you'll be able to have this. Yes, of course. And so why a fact? I don't tread on those words lightly, fact and truth. Those are big words. But I think a fact because these are things we know from indisputable evidence collected by researchers and teachers, by ordinary citizens of all colors and backgrounds. And you know, when I teach a class at St. Kate's called The Global Search for Justice, Dismantling Racism, we teach about the role of everyone. Everyone has a role. You know, that old gospel song, all God's children have a place in the choir. Everyone has a role in this. It's not a question of whether you're white, black, Latino, Asian, but it's a question of where are you? Where do you stand? What gifts do you bring? And what can you do with them? And so what are these truths? Well, the first is race is a social construction. And what does that mean? And this is one of the tenets of critical race theory. It means that race has no basis in biology. It's a little difficult for us to wrap our heads around that because we can see it all the time. We look around and we say, you look white, you're black. People look at me, they don't always know. They speak Spanish to me, so I guess I've disputed that a little bit because it's not in my background. But how is it that race is not biology? The genetic variation within one so-called race is greater than the genetic variation between two people of two different races. It may be hard to understand that because we can see each other and say, well, you look like this and you look like that, you must be related to this person and that. But the reality is that you may be more genetically like someone who is from Nigeria than you are genetically like someone who's from Germany or Ireland, even though we're in Minnesota with a huge German and Irish population. And so that's the first point. In a sense, I think the corollary to this is there's so much effort was made to segregate this country. And I don't think it would have been necessary if the so-called racial groups had been that different. The mere fact that we are one species is itself a sign of the similarity. Okay, and so there's a lot of history to this, but of course, the third point here is where I think this is where the history comes up, which is that this so-called thing we call whiteness has historically changed over time. Not all people who are white today were considered white in the past. Jewish people were not considered white. Southern Europeans, when they came here later than Western Europeans, were not considered white. Italians, Irish were not always considered white. Irish were compared, and we have many of you are Irish. I just know it. You know, Irish were compared to African Americans. I can't even use the terminology because it includes a racial slur. But Irish were called black people turned inside out. They were depicted as apes in the newspapers, the 1850s and 60s. And they lived in close proximity to African Americans, which is an important part of history that we don't know very much about. We do know, we don't hear about it very much, but it's very true. And so whiteness is this unclear thing that was created, and the shifting boundary is a shifting boundary that only included more people as it became in the interest of white supremacy. I'm going to state my position that that's why that boundary shifted. And when it really shifted was after World War II, when we created more suburbs that allowed the formerly white ethnics to move into neighborhoods with other white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and it allowed Jews to move into those neighborhoods. And when we look today at the so-called intermarriage rates between whites of different ethnicities or whites of different national origins or white Christians and Jews, they're very high because the differences no longer make a difference. They no longer make a social difference. They may be a private difference. You may celebrate your Irish heritage in your family, but nobody any longer says, I don't want you marrying an Irish person, which is more like what it was when my mom grew up in Frogtown and went to the German Catholic Church and not the Polish one. So society changes. Race is a social construct. The importance of race can change. This is my favorite one, and that is that racism is primarily institutionally created and perpetuated by government laws and policies at the federal, state, and local level, private industry, and interpersonal actions. But really, we spend far too much time talking about racism as this label that we attach to people. Well, are you racist or aren't you? Or as Donald Trump says, I'm the least racist person in the room. I don't know he said that, or I'm the least racist person that you'll ever meet. That was curious, I thought, when he was taken to court in 1974 for explicitly discriminating against Black applicants in his New York properties. And when he said all the terrible things he said about Mexicans, about senators, women senators of color, about other countries, and so on. And of course, Melania Trump would have never been accepted in this country in the early part of the 20th century because she is Slovenian, and Slovenia was considered one of the most lowly of the European ethnic groups, and so she would have never been acceptable. But we don't talk about that because that's how domination and white supremacy are perpetuated, is by forgetting. It's not only about remembering, it's about forgetting. It's very important that we forget. It's very important that we forget. Strom Thurmond, South Carolina segregationist, who, years before his death, it was finally exposed that he had a child with a Black woman who was the daughter of the domestic who worked in his South Carolina home. And yet his whole life, he was one of the greatest, if you will, fighters for segregation. And so forgetting is very important to the perpetuation of these things. We've always tried to make white people forget if they had anything in common with people of color. We've always tried to make them forget that and destroy that. And there are many historical examples of that. The earliest one was probably in 1660. There's a wonderful, I really need to send you, I'm going to write it down. I need to send all of you some links. There's a wonderful NPR story about the invention of race. That's an hour-long audio story you can watch and listen to. And the story is about the very early colonial days of this country. There were African slaves who were brought here on slave ships, but then were freed after 5 to 8 years, the way that white indentured servants were. And so there was this ambiguity in the connection between race and slavery. And in 1660 or 1665, 3 indentured servants ran away from the plantation where they were working because they were against the conditions. And when they were arrested, when they were caught, they were differentially charged. The Black man who ran away was given servitude for life, and the whites were given 5 to 8 years of additional servitude. That was the first law that was written that expressly said there would be different punishments by race. And I think that was in Virginia. It might have been in another colony. Around the same time, there was a biracial woman, Elizabeth Key, the daughter of a white slave owner and a Black slave woman, who sued to be considered white by the courts. And she won because she said, I am the daughter of a white man and I shall inherit the race of my, and they had not thought about that. The colonists hadn't thought about that yet. They hadn't figured out how is it that we're going to, what are they going to do with people like me? They hadn't, but what they did after that is they said, well, we've got to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so from this point forward, every mixed race child shall be considered a Black child, what we call the rule of hypodescent, or the one-drop rule. And the racial status of the father shall not be the basis of the child's racial status. And so we created this thing. We created this. And that's very critical to what's happening today. Lastly, I think is just as I teach, and I always try to find new material in my classes, but as I teach and as I learn, I'm just struck by the fact of how much of the history of racial inequality and racism is really the history of non-whites trying to make the country work for them. It's absolutely astonishing. Most people didn't protest the country as it was. Most people simply wanted to be a part of it and were willing to deal with the inconveniences of being a minority in this country. There's many examples. One example I love to tell, and for many different groups, Asians, for instance, in this country were barred from citizenship because the first naturalization law in this country, the law that regulates whether or not someone can become a citizen if they've immigrated here, not if they're born here, but if they immigrate here, was in 1790. It's pretty early. That's pretty early. And it said that any free white person could become a citizen. And so they made sure that only whites would become full citizens. That is to say, have the right to vote, sit on juries, and have certain other kinds of protections. And the 13th and the 14th Amendments changed that for those who were born here who are African American, at least in law. But then the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act stopped Asians from immigrating here and also barred them from citizenship until 1952. 1952. And so in 1923, and I'm not a historian, but I know a couple of dates really well, and that's one of them. A Japanese immigrant, Osawa was his name, went to the Supreme Court and petitioned to be considered white. And he was not the only one. There were 47 cases of Asians petitioning the court of the United States, the Supreme Court, to be considered white so that they could become citizens. And his appeal was, I may not be someone with white skin, but I believe in the principles of this country. I believe in the idea of America. And he actually used Benedict Arnold as an example, and he said Benedict Arnold might have been an American in name, but was a traitor in philosophy because he did not believe in the Republic and its values. And the court rejected his appeal. And they did that for most other groups. Most Asians did not get considered white. They were Christian. They were financially self-sustaining. They simply wanted to belong fully. And so I'm struck by the history as I learn more about it. I teach a book in one of my classes called The Color of Law, which is rather dense. It's not difficult to read, but it's quite detailed about the history of segregation. And it is astonishing the extent to which city councils and governments went to maintain segregated neighborhoods. It is stunning. Whites who wanted to live in integrated, racially integrated communities, whites who rented their homes to African Americans. There's a story about a white homeowner in Berkeley, California. In 1956, 1 year after Rosa Parks refused to move off of the bus. And this was a white teacher who rented his home to a black teacher, a fellow teacher, in a neighborhood in Berkeley, California, where they had a covenant restriction on who could be in that neighborhood. And he was fined. The black family was evicted, and the white owner was fined and never allowed to own property. Actually, he was barred from getting another loan as a consequence of integrating the neighborhood. So we have to understand the systemic nature of this. And I'm not trying to give you all a pass, because most of you are white. Simply telling the history, this is what we've forgotten, that this happened. And on and on. If you were a white person who taught a slave to read, you would be punished. I think there was a distinction in the number of lashes you would get. This was in the really bad old days, let's say in the 1700s. If you were a slave and you learned to read, you'd get 40 lashes. If you were a white person that taught a slave to read, you'd get 15. So all of us have been signed on to a system and a program of white supremacy. And what we're seeing, I think, with the critical race theory panic, is what it really is the fulfillment of those centuries of conditioning that now don't even require government intervention. The people have bought the whole program, and again, have forgotten any allegiances or any complications, anything that would challenge the myth, this myth of whiteness, this myth that now is governing how people act. And so this happened everywhere. It happened here. And there's documentaries about, it happened here in St. Paul, it happened here in Minneapolis, it happened in Duluth, as you know. I could be talking about lynching, I could be talking about redlining, right? One of the stories I like to tell my students is about, there's a very good TPT documentary about I-94, and I'm gonna check the time here. And it talks about, well, as many of you know, by now, of course, I-94 went right through the Black community in St. Paul. My father grew up in that community and lived on St. Anthony and Dale. So their house was spared. They watched the other side of the street be demolished. The other story about 94 that you may not know is that 94 does not disrupt the Prospect Park neighborhood. It curves, right? You're on 94 going to Minneapolis, and it curves, and then you cross the river, and you're in the Cedar Riverside area. And the reason that and we all love the Prospect Park neighborhood. I've never lived there, but I've thought about it. And the Witch's Tower, and the beautiful tree canopy, and the quaintness and the coziness of it, especially this time of year. You just want to get your whatever pumpkin latte and walk the tree-lined streets. It's a beautiful neighborhood. It's beautiful. And the residents of that neighborhood knew people in the Minnesota Department of Transportation. They were connected. It was mainly the wives of researchers at the University of Minnesota who were living in that neighborhood and had connections at Minnesota Department of Transportation. And so they wrote to MnDOT and said, please don't put the freeway through our neighborhood. We love it as it is. And they got what they asked for. There was a community of activists and leaders in Rondo who also asked for the freeway to move. And in fact, there was a northern route that you might have heard about that was along Energy Park Drive, which has for a long time been a largely industrial area, right? It was the railroad line, and today it's mainly, well, it was Bandana Square when I was a kid, and they were doing all that neat restoration, but it's not very residential. But the city did not opt to take that route, and I'm trying to uncover the history of what exactly was deliberated. But they did go through Rondo. And there's an organization now, Rondo Reconnect, that's doing very good work, and I believe now has actually gotten their full funding to build a land bridge that will reconnect Rondo. I think that's a good thing. I don't think it can replace the loss. There's no way to replace 700 homes in the middle of the 20th century and 300 businesses. And the intergenerational effects of that, which we know are devastating. So there's so much to say about the range of ways in which we've had an institutional sanctioning of racism. Let me try to talk about now what we're talking about with the controversy, and I hope this doesn't have too many words on it. And I guess my question as I thought about this conversation today was critical race theory understood, misunderstood, or deliberately misrepresented? My three possibilities. I looked up some of the most recent information on where the laws and the bans against critical race theory are. I have a link for that, but I'm not going to go through the trouble of finding it, but it's in this presentation, and I'll find a way to share that with Joan, and you could share it amongst yourselves by an education organization, not biased, just. And at this point, we have 27 states that have introduced bills and 12 that have enacted some kind of ban. And this is the substance of the bans. The substance of the bans is not about critical race theory per se. They are more about, if we read here, the discussion, training, and orientation that the US is inherently racist, as well as any discussions about conscious and unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, and oppression. And I think importantly, these are, and I'm quoting, I should say I'm quoting a sociologist here. This is, you'd have to look at each individual state to see the language they're using. But it's astonishing how much they are focused on this particular, on this, right? On the teaching, on even teaching that the country is racist. I think inherently you could have a debate about, but I suppose, you know, even that's questionable. You know, but to say that we can't talk about bias, privilege. I mean, a system that is documented, right? It's a fact. We have documents. I have the redlining map of St. Paul from 1940. And the same neighborhoods that were redlined 60 years ago are the same neighborhoods that are at high risk for COVID-19 infections. So the past is not even past, it's still with us. It still matters. And so this is what it's really about. It's about teaching any kind of critical thinking about the country. When I say critical thinking, what do I mean by critical? I'm associate professor of critical studies of race and ethnicity. What is that? It means thinking about looking beneath the official story of what is told. If America claims to be what it is, then, well, let's look more closely and see if that's what's really happening. You know, is it always, you know, or is it sometimes? Is it in some places and not others? You know, I'm not a pessimist. I'm really not. And so but this is the focus. And so I think the terminology, and I think this was in one of those articles I sent to Joan, but that's helpful here is to talk about a manufactured controversy. In this case, I have to say where this came from, and there is a history to it, but there's a particular pundit, there's a particular opinion maker, and I don't, his name is failing me, but it's in some of the readings, and I'm not trying to say his name in order for you to focus on this particular person, but it's important to understand that there was one right-wing, conservative, very conservative pundit who thought this was really the thing to focus on. And in fact, Donald Trump recruited him to help him write the statement on the 1776 history, which was Trump's rebuttal of the 1619 project, which Trump, I think, wrote in right before the election or right after. I think it was dated something like November 5th, 2020. And so, which is an interesting statement to say the least. I mean, the statement is kind of a glorification of the country, like a country that's never existed. I mean, no country could make this kind of statement about itself. And it includes statements about the abolition of slavery and all. So it sort of assumes that this was it's what we call a post facto kind of thing, right? You write something as if you knew this was going to happen all along. Well, if the country wanted to abolish slavery, why did it institute it, right? Why did it actually create a new form of slavery in its inception that was unlike any system of slavery in any previous part of the world that we know about? You know, this is one of the things people bring up. Well, wasn't there slavery in other eras? And I don't need to go down that tangent, but I just want to say that no country had created a system in which slavery would be an inherited status from one generation, a permanent condition of an entire people. That was new. We didn't do it alone. The rest of Latin America, Spanish and Portuguese colonies did it too. And that's what we created. But I think what we're dealing with is a manufactured controversy that is really a denial of the true, full, complex history of the US, that what's really happened here. What about people that are not the creators, but the followers? And I hope I'm being, you know, just in this statement, but Robin DiAngelo, who's an anti-racist educator, she's been criticized. She's written a book called White Fragility. She's been criticized by some for being thought of as a lot of things, but I think many of the reactions are simply about a resistance to considering what she's proposing. And one of the ideas that I think she proposes that's quite good in its accuracy is the concept of white fragility. And what does that mean? It means that in some cases, the emotions, the feelings that some white people have, direct and determine when an issue is worthy of concern. And so it's about the emotions, it's about whose emotions matter. It's like saying Black Lives Matter. Well, not just Black Lives Matter, Black emotions matter, right? But she's really telling us that many times our country, our society, our relations with each other run in a way that always protects the emotions of white people. And that's an outcome of white supremacy, that their emotions matter more. And how other people feel, how non-white people feel is not honored. And I feel like that's operating with this manufactured controversy. That this is getting attention, that we're even talking about this thing from a bunch of people who have never read one piece of critical race theory, which was created by an amazing thinker, a beautiful, Black woman professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor of law, who also coined the term intersectionality that you may have heard about. Kimberly Crenshaw has talks on YouTube and on the TED Talk, on TED. And one of the reasons she came up with intersectionality was because she was looking at a court case. This is critical race theory, by the way. This is applying critical race theory to a legal situation. She was looking at a case in which Black women were not getting hired by General Motors, and they went to sue in court for discrimination. And they went to sue as Black women, as women living at the intersection of racism and sexism. And the court did not rule in their favor, because the court said that General Motors did not discriminate on the basis of race or gender, because there were Black men working at General Motors. Of course, most of them were working in the janitorial and the menial positions of the company. And white women were working at General Motors. This was in the late 1970s, so after the civil rights legislation had passed, right? And Title IX for that matter. And white women were working at General Motors, but they were all in secretarial and clerical work. And because of the unwillingness of the judge and the law to see the possibility that someone could be discriminated against because of more than one difference, these Black women were excluded from justice. I don't think anybody in this room can claim that that's fair. And that's what critical race theory is. That's what that's what the theory and the approach is trying to see. How is it possible that after movements to guarantee, that ban discrimination, to guarantee, to say that you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, sex, color, creed, and so on, that it's still possible for people to be excluded from a system? And that is the perspective, by the way, that our students at St. Kate's understand and resonate with more deeply than anything. Because as you know, St. Kate's today, the student population is 40 or 45% students of color, women of color. Many of them first generation students, the first in their family to go to college. They're amazing. And they're here because of what this institution represents, because it says something to them that was deeper than what they were hearing from the University of Minnesota, or I won't say St. Thomas. So let's move on, and then I want to stop, and I want to really open up to some questions, and I need to do that now. Let me just say a couple of things. I mean, I put the myths here, and I do think there's incredible misinformation. Marco Rubio, the senator, tied critical race theory to Marxism, and that to me just seems to be sort of the extreme of the outlandishness of this. I mean, what on earth does that have to do with this? It's of course, that's an old fear in this country. you all witnessed that, you know, the McCarthy era I mean, the way in which Martin Luther King was surveilled by the FBI and followed and accused of being everything that people would fear. Homosexual, communist, Marxist, I mean, just on and on. Lies and lies. So I just want to say, and I'm going to stop. You know, there's basic tenets, and I'm going to leave them up here. But I'll just say that critical race theory began in the 70s because of the fact that we still saw some of the same problems with racism that we saw before the civil rights movement, and that's where it began as an approach to try to understand, well, how can we understand racist outcomes still being produced from the law as it currently exists, and I suppose that's the basis on which other disciplines that are not in the law, like sociology or education, use critical race theory. But generally speaking, no high school that I know of teaches critical race theory. So it's interesting that this is the supposed target of those who are the critics, because schools don't teach it because nobody even understands. It's very complex stuff for the most part, and it really was part of a legal framework that certain people, I didn't learn it even in sociology, because it was something really approached in legal studies and critical legal studies. But there's several tenets here that you can look through. I want to stop. I want to allow some questions and some discussion. I do think that there's a context. I'll finish with this, which is I think there's a context to what's happening now, why this is happening. And I think some of it has to do with the increased voting of people of color. I think even there's something as recent as the Georgia election, in which Black women and Stacey Abrams came out in full force and elected, you know, it's 2 Democratic senators, was extraordinary. I think it has to do with the increase in the awareness. We've witnessed now police violence against Black bodies in a way that many whites had never seen before. And the video of George Floyd dying is an indisputable example of that. And so I think what we're seeing is a kind of resentment and a fear on the part of a dominant group and an attempt to regain power, an attempt to really regain that by any means necessary. We've seen that before, and it may seem like a stretch, but I think it gets a bit academic. I think I wasn't alive, but I think Richard Nixon's election, right? Nixon used the concept of the silent majority, and he used television ads that portrayed the increase in crime as this looming threat. And I think the fear that the 1960s social movements brought to many Americans, you know, the anti-war movement and the women's movement, right, and the LGBT movement and the civil rights and Black power movements, resulted in a backlash of many to try to reassert a version of the United States that kept all of those groups subordinated. And so I don't think it's coincidental that this is happening now. And I do think that of course the former president had something to do with that, with the routine defamation of people of color, women, immigrants, entire countries, you know. And so that's what I have to offer you in terms of why this might be happening now. So thank you so much for giving me the time, and I'm going to stop talking and stick around as long as I can.
So just stay where you're at. We're going to go around with the mic, but there is a question in the chat. Can you give us a quick and clear definition of what is critical race theory in your opinion?
Okay. Critical race theory is an approach to understanding how racial inequality is perpetuated in a context in which racial progress has been made. Okay, I'm trying my best here because it's hard to define in one sentence what exactly it is, right? So let me say it. Let me say it in another way. I thought I had one here that was. So it's an attempt to understand how it is that in an era of official racial equality and the bans on discrimination, we continue to see the perpetuation of racial inequality and racism within the confines of the law. I hope that's helpful. I mean, I can give a quick example. For instance, the use of force with police is one example of this, right? The ability of police to use force and to not be questioned in their use of force, right? But then for that force to be disproportionately exerted on African Americans when you look at all the statistics.
Okay, so just to be clear, we've got about 20 people online. So if we can have Professor Daniel repeat the question that you say, just so it goes to the microphone for the Zoom call, okay? Who has a comment, question? Let's start over here and then we'll go to Father.
Thank you. So what do we do about the SF-181? The SF-181 where we claim our race and ethnicity for the United States government. And we could actually choose every category, but definitely one of them is white. So what happens if I choose that?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm not sure what the FS-181 is.
It's your race and ethnicity claim to the United States as far as your work.
Oh, I see. It's a form that you're filling out when you're doing your routine paperwork. Okay, so are you wondering how do we use that in order to get justice, or what? State the question again. I'm sorry.
Well, with the SF-181, there's like 5 different categories.
Yes. Right.
American, white.
The big
Black,
5. Yep.
Asian.
Yep.
But it also tells you to choose all of them.
Yes.
And if I chose one, the one that claims where I'm from, this particular land, would make all of us in the category all white.
I don't think so. Why do you think that everybody is called white who's here?
If you're from this, they give you plots of land. That if you're from here, you would be considered this.
I don't understand what you're saying. Okay.
It's very important.
Who gets plots? Who gets plots of land?
No, it's acknowledging the birthright. I think she's saying based on where.
So what do I get as a result of being born here? Yeah.
If I'm not a native
American?
then I would fall in the category of white.
Why don't you fall in the category of black?
Because for me, it's a choice, and black is not, doesn't have any particular land attached to it on the SF-181. So everybody has a place of origin except the blacks. But the white category tells you if you're a native born American, then this is your category.
Okay, you guys have to help me with this because I'm not following your logic here. I'm trying. I want to understand. Maybe can you help? This is important. This is important.
I just want to see if I'm understanding you correctly. So are you saying when you're filling out this form that if you're Asian or Pacific Islander, that reflects a certain land? And if you're Native, that reflects a certain land. And if you're white, that reflects a certain land. But if you're black, that does not reflect a certain land. Is that what you are saying? Okay, that's kind of what I thought I heard you say.
So how does that matter in the everyday life of us here in America? So for instance, if I'm Asian, if I say let's say I'm from Vietnam, right? Or I'm Vietnamese American. What difference does it make here in America? Yes,
I think the difference is when you enter to the courts, one of those are legally somebody that they should respect. And one is that they have an option to totally not respect. To me, it is that rational thinking that they think we could be outside the category and disregard. But yeah, here.
I'm not sure, I'm gonna try to still wrestle with that. But let's
What I'm
talk
wrestling with
afterwards.
is we could be all.
Hmm?
Yeah, I'm wrestling with we could be all.
We can choose, I mean, the sense is that those boxes let us choose, right? What our category is. But I'm kind of thinking, I guess, concretely, does choosing that category mean something for our actual material everyday life? And does it matter for actually our everyday life? I mean, I live with this every day because, you know, I was taught to be proud to be Black, but I know that the way that I look and the way that I live my everyday life is not the same as how you live your everyday life because of the colorism in our society, skin tone difference. And I'm a man and you're a woman, right? So there's an intersectional component here too. So I want to talk to you after we're finished because I want to understand everything you're saying. And I don't know if, to me, I have always thought that African American culture is absolutely as legitimate of a culture as any other.
It's not a category.
And Asian is not a category? Or, I mean, Asian. Yeah, those are categories too. Okay, we'll talk afterwards. We'll talk afterwards. All right. Thank you. Thank you for the comments. Question. Yeah.
One of the first words you used when you began to read was truth.
Yes.
This morning, I have a Monday morning group. It's been 20 years ago, every Monday we talk. And the topic today was truth. And one of the questions that became a haunting one for me was, I think a lot of us grew up with objective truth. But it doesn't seem to exist anymore as we are living our American life. There's only subjective truth. People have what they believe to be true, they believe to be true. And there's not an objective standard. And it's pretty hard to live that way without, I think, an agreement, the division in this country. I'm just suggesting, I'm not looking for an answer at the moment, but
Yeah.
just wondering what you would think about that. Is there no objective truth anymore? That is kind of the foundation of our lives.
I think there is an objective truth, but I also think that there are perspectives that come from people's real experience, and that some of us can only know what we know from where we stand. We cannot know from another point of view. But I think that what's happening is there's, from the same forces that are criticizing critical race theory, I think there's kind of an assault on truth in the interest of maintaining a kind of control and a kind of status quo. And so I feel like the perception, I agree with you that we perceive that, oh, there is no truth anymore because everyone is talking about perspective and subjectivity or something like that. But the reality is there is, and the social justice fighters across the color spectrum have never said that there was no truth. James Baldwin would have never said that. Alice Walker, all these thinkers would have never said that. And so there is. I do not agree that there's no objective truth, as I think you also believe, right? But there's a war on objective truth in the interest of. There's an assault on truth. There's an assault on truth. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dora Jones Robinson. I was here last week with you. For one, I really think that this is a critical conversation that we need to be having not only in this building, but in every city, state, government around. But I think that giving it an hour is not giving it the attention that it really needs and deserves. Because I really personally came here again today because I want to hear from the older generation, the older white generation. I want to hear their thoughts, their feelings about what took place. Where were they at in their heart and their spirit? I really wanted to hear that. And so we didn't have enough time for me to be able to sync and get that information from them, especially from the white women talking to a Black woman. I really needed to hear something from them. And so I think by an hour talking about racial theory, critical race theory, is not giving it the justice it needs. And I think we should have, or whoever organized this, I think we should have had more time for a real conversation and discussion with the women, because I would have loved to hear from them. That's why I came back.
Thank you for that. And I will say that I'm happy to, I would too, and I'm happy to come back and listen. I'm happy to help in trying to organize a follow-up event if people want to do that. I agree. And I'll listen.
Just one more thing. I just think that we need to be, I think that it's critical that we be listeners. Sometimes as presenters, we talk a lot because we want to get the information out there. But to be great in what we do, we have to be listeners of the people. And so this is why I came back, because I wanted to listen. But thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I understand we've got about 5 hands up, and I know we asked Professor Williams to come for an hour, which is
I'll stay as long as people want to stay. I'll stay as long as people want to stay.
Okay. Will be okay with extending for a little while? How about another 15 minutes or so? I just want to respect people's dinner time, and I also want to respect the time that we asked Professor Williams. So I have 3 questions. I'm going to just go along here, and we'll try and give chance to pull. And again, Professor Williams, if you can try and restate the question, just so folks on Zoom can hear, okay?
This isn't a question, it's really a comment, a little bit in response to Father John's comment that we used to know the truth. My opinion, from what I'm learning the last couple of years, is we think we used to know the truth. And I'm absolutely flabbergasted the last couple of years, what I'm learning and how untrue so much of it was about our history. And it's confounding. Just, you know, and I think I was oblivious. I'll just tell you one tiny story. My husband and I used to go down to Mississippi to play golf. And, but I did some volunteer work at a Black church in Bay St. Louis, and the lady that ran things there was a Black woman, and we were helping people with their tax forms. And she was talking, she grew up in the area and wanted to be a nun. She'd gone to a Catholic school run by German nuns, and she wanted to go to be a nun. The German school, and the priest said, "You do not want to go there. The way they will treat you." And I said, I suppose they were kind of ignorant, the things they said and did. She said they were not ignorant. They knew what they were doing. So that was kind of enlightening for me, because I frankly grew up, I think maybe we had 1 or 2 Black people walk past our house occasionally. I simply did not know anybody. The first time I knew anybody was when I went in the Peace Corps, and for about 3 or 4 months I lived with 2 other women. One was Black, one was white. But anyway, I just wanted to comment a little bit about my experience, a little bit of what you're asking. Thank you.
I had the wonderful opportunity to do research in Ghana and Nigeria in the 1970s. And I realize now that a lot of the prejudice against the Black people is founded on ignorance, that they indeed had a very rich culture for centuries. In the 1500s, they created wonderful sculptures of human beings. And later people said, who taught them to do this? What European king? Nobody taught them. And I lived at the University of Ghana, and those professors were so highly educated, spoke many languages. But I give you an example of music. In the 1500s, the Portuguese came and they listened to the complicated polyrhythmic music that the people of Ghana had, and they said, these savages have no music. They sent a little boy to beating on a piece of iron, and then each drum comes in, higgledy piggledy, each one coming in whenever he feels like it. It actually was a very complex polyrhythmic structure. And when I studied with PhD students at the University of Ghana, they could not hold their own in playing those rhythms. But then the contrast is the way I was received. Everybody helped me with my research. I was going to teach music and art of Africa at St. Catherine's. The bishop sent me around in his car to the villages so I could record the new indigenous church music coming into the churches. Whenever there was a lineup, they all motioned me to go to the head of the line because I was the only white person. If we could only reverse that here. Anyway, we all need education in the history of culture in the black countries.
I know they keep trying to they get the people of color in the school to do better. And I've heard people talk about school choice, and I'm wondering if that would help any of those people in the education to bring the people of color up.
Well, I'll say what I know about that, but if other people have things they know, they should speak as well. You know, school choice does not tend to help students of color that much, in part because they still experience more discipline, more disciplinary treatment, whether they're in a predominantly white school or a school that's predominantly other students of color. So, you know, suspension, for instance, is much higher for Black students than it is for other students. And then when they are seen as disruptive, they get categorized differently, right? As emotional behavioral disorder instead of ADHD, right? Attention deficit. And so there's a racial gap in how behavior is interpreted, right? I mean, much less gifted and talented, right? So sometimes you have kids who are actually gifted and talented and they're goofing around because they're bored, but because of our stereotypes about Black children and Black kids, teachers don't see that. And so they assume that this kid is, you know, this is a Black kid, and, you know, probably got problems at home, right? They start doing all of these stereotypes. And so, you know, should we have more integrated schools? Yes, I think we should, for everyone, for everyone's benefit. But from what I know about the school choice, it kind of does not tend to benefit those Black and Latino kids very much. I think we have to do more to teach the teachers how to respond to kids and to treat the kids equally as much as we need to have, kids change schools. I hope that helps.
Nobody else said anything. I just got one thing I want to say. So I just want to tell you, I was actually one of the original families that was uprooted out of Rondo. We lived on Rondo in McCubbin. We had to move. I remember I used to play down in the ditch. That was back in 68, 69. Then I went to Maxfield Elementary, where it was predominantly an all-black school, because we had not even integrated, right? I was one of the first children that was integrated into white school. So I went from Maxfield, they bused us all the way out to Frost Lake Elementary. When I got to Frost Lake Elementary in the 1st and 2nd grade, I got to this school and I was amazed. They had a fish tank in the wall. The carpet on the floor was immaculate. The classrooms were just beautiful. And to me, as a kid coming from Maxfield, which was an all-black school that was very underfunded, and sent me to Frost Lake, my ability to want to even learn stepped it up. So when you're in underfunded schools, kids don't feel valued and they don't want to learn. But as soon as I went to Frost Lake, I was the first Black bus patrol lady. I really was. I had my flag, my badge. I was so proud of myself, but I had to move to an all-white school to get that. And that just, I don't know, I just wanted to share that with you guys so you guys can know how I felt going into a all-white school, coming from being with a Black family. So I just wanted to share that story. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And I'll say too that that's, so that there's not always one uniform experience, right? And I think part of it too is from what I know about school choice, it's not my area of expertise, but I do know that not that many Black students can take advantage of it, right? Black families are not always able to take advantage of it. Sometimes it requires transportation, right, to a faraway school, so it wouldn't have been in the same way that you had it, right? And that it also allows white families to resegregate, right? So it allows white families to move then to schools that are predominantly white and to try to move away from. But I'm thankful for your experience. That's crucial. Yeah.
Well, I'm probably a little bit younger than her. So we lived here for most of our time in our lives. We moved from St. Louis to Minnesota. And about the time I joined high school, my sister was in grade school and she wound up at that school. So I went to Tarleton and she went to yes, we had a very hard time in those schools because they were very, very prejudiced by that coming towards, coming into it. I see how the integration happened, but their mindsets didn't integrate as well 20 some odd years later in those areas. But my question is, are you for or against critical race theory being taught? And if so, who teaches it?
I am in favor of a true history of the country being taught. I am in favor of the reality of privilege, discrimination, racism, sexism being taught in schools. And so to me, that's just history. It doesn't have to be called critical race theory. I think everyone should teach it. We have a major problem with a lack of teachers of color, particularly Black teachers in our schools. And that's a big problem that we can't get into with this time that we have today and that I don't know enough about, honestly. But that's a big problem. But I think everyone should be teaching it. You know, it's not, it's US history. It's American history.
But not only teaching it, it helps us to heal.
Absolutely,
It
you
helps
know,
us all.
and younger people are in a position to be able to do that better than us old folks who, you know, we've been, you know, stuck in our ways sometimes. I'm talking about myself, you know. So, and so I think everyone should, I do think it should be taught. I do, yeah.
So I'm realizing maybe I wished I lived in the village, because I think the conversations in the bistro and at dinner are going to be very interesting over the next couple of days. Joan, we might have to think about having Professor Williams come back. Maybe you want to give a formal thanks and then give a little bit for.
I think we should all give a formal thanks. This is great. Well, thank you for opening the door for his coming back. We now heard him say he would be glad to do that. So thank you so very, very much. This, although a lot of history is what we need, I think, before we can actually have a conversation around this issue. So I'm grateful for what happened this afternoon. And for me, it's a start. And I would say that that would be true for a great number of us here. So if it's okay, I'd like to do just a couple quick announcements. I'll try to do this very quickly. The incumbent candidate, our current mayor, Melvin Carter, is now able to join us on Friday morning, October 15th at 10:30 here in the auditorium. The Ramsey County Election Bureau advises, some of you heard this morning if you were with us, with the uncertainty of the mail these days, and in order to be assured you will get your ballot in on time, the latest to apply for an absentee ballot is this Wednesday. Now, I do have the form, so if you know somebody who is still wanting to vote absentee and needs the form, just tell them to get in touch with me. If you have your ballot, they suggest you mail it by October 29th in order for it to be counted. Again, because the uncertainty of the mails. If you're interested in voting early, the site for early voting in this area is the Highland Golf Course. And the early voting will begin Tuesday, October 26th. And if you're interested, I do have the hours that they are going to be available. Election day, November 2nd, you will be voting at the Highland Park Rec Center, as we have been doing in the past. So we hope to see you Friday for our conversation with candidate Melvin Carter. And again, thank you, Dr. Williams, for this very, very enlightening.
Thank you very much. It was an honor. Thank you so much.
And on behalf of the residents of Condolet Village and the Justice Office of the Sisters, we have a few little gifts. We don't know where you live these days, but we're hoping you can find a nice place for the mum flowers.
What's that supposed to mean?
Can't get gifts to political candidates and office holders, but we hope that you can find a place to plant these, and then I think we have a card and maybe some goodies for your next in-person class.
I'll take it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful to talk with you.
Georgia was rocking. Woman on the ballot. Oh, is that right? Yes. Mayor. Never had a woman mayor or
Hello.